Welcome to the Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs podcast, a place for podcasters to learn what's actually working in the world of podcasting and how to use their podcast to generate consistent leads in their business. I'm your host, Jenny, and I'm so excited you're here.
Hey, Savvies, welcome back to another episode of the podcast. In today's episode, we're talking about probably one of the most asked podcasting questions. What exactly is considered a good number of downloads per episode? So I want to start off by saying that your downloads are definitely going to vary depending on a couple of different factors. So first up, do you have a built-in audience already? If you already have a decent sized audience who loves everything that you do, then obviously your downloads are going to be higher than someone who starts out with no audience or a small audience. The second thing to consider is the length of time that you've been podcasting. So as I'm sure you've heard me say millions of times, starting a podcast isn't really an overnight massive amount of downloads kind of thing. It definitely takes some time to grow your listenership. It's important to be patient. So yeah, if you've been podcasting for like 3 weeks, you're obviously not going to be hitting crazy download numbers. And then the third thing to consider is your actual topic. So if you have a more niche down show, then you may have a ton of downloads, especially if your niche is very underserved. Or you may have a moderate amount of downloads, but your listeners are super engaged because the topic is so niche. So that's going to go two different ways. So now, after we've talked about those three different factors, let's talk about average download numbers. So Libsyn, which is a podcast host, arguably, I think they're actually one of the first ever podcast hosts that existed. They share average download numbers pretty regularly with their audience, which I find super helpful. So as of recently, if after 30 days, your podcast episode has over 123 downloads, then you're in the top 50% of podcasts. If it has over 1,000 downloads, you're in the top 20% of podcasts. If it has over 2,900 downloads after 30 days, you're in the top 10% of podcasts. If it has over 6,600 downloads, you're in the top 5% of podcasts. If it has over 17,000 downloads, you're in the top 2% of podcasts. And if it has over 30,000 downloads within 30 days, you're in the top 1%. For example, starting on the average lower end of things, if your episode has 123 downloads after just 30 days, then I think you're doing just fine. People are often shocked when I tell them the stat because they expect the average downloads to be much higher than they actually are. Although podcasting has been around since 2004, it's only really recently started gaining traction in the past 10 years or so, and really accelerated in the past 5 years or so. So if you're getting more than 123 downloads per episode, then you should be so very proud of yourself because that means you're doing better than the average podcast. So if this is you, give yourself a big pat on the back right now. I am so proud of you. You should be proud of yourself. Just give yourself kudos. But if you're getting less than 123 downloads per episode, that's totally okay too. I want you to celebrate yourself anyway, because your message is still getting heard by your people, whether it's just 75 people or 750 people. It still counts. So don't beat yourself up if you're not quite to the 123 plus downloads per episode mark quite yet. I know it can be a little discouraging, but podcasting, like I said a million times, is not an overnight success. It is a slow burn. You're going to build a really engaged audience if you stay consistent with your podcast and you keep putting out content that your listeners love, but it's not going to happen overnight. So just keep plugging along, keep chugging along, and celebrate your success along the way. Because like I said, if you have 75 people listening, great. 750, great. Like, it's all relative. So just celebrate yourself. That's basically the moral of the story. Celebrate yourself, whether you are in the top 50% or the top 1%, or even you're not quite at the average download mark yet. Be proud regardless. So yeah, that is it for today's episode. I would absolutely love to hear from you. Were you shocked to hear the average download number? Did you expect it to be higher or did you expect it to be lower? I'd love to hear from you. DM me on Instagram at jenny.sunnison and let me know. But yeah, you can check out the show notes for this episode by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com. And I'll see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, and leave a review. You can find us at savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com and on Facebook at Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs and Instagram at Savvy Podcasting. Make sure to join our free Facebook community for podcasters by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com/community and join in on the exclusive community just for Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs listeners. I'll see you there.